Hello and welcome to this video which is about The War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. Now, a war photographer is quite obvious. It's somebody that takes photographs of wars. Now, we're going to look at photographs first of all and the idea of photography. Now, we've got three front covers from three different stories. One, 9/11, the terrorist attack in New York. The next one in the middle, we've got the Boston Marathon, where a bomber set off a bomb during a marathon. And then the third one, which is something quite recent, and I think it was ashore on one of the Greek islands of a refugee, and the father and the boy had died as a result of this, the refugee crisis. Now, the idea is that a picture can tell a story in 1,000 words very quickly. And so the idea of what we're going to do is look at this idea of photographs and what do they do and the power that they have. Now, photographs like these have such a powerful impact on people. And actually lots of money can be made from photographs, and actually, people can do very, very well financially from one photograph itself, because what happens is that photograph wants to be used in lots of different things, in different newspapers, different magazines, and so they create iconic images, and they help us remember something quite bad. Okay, now because we're talking about photography, photography has changed within the last 50 years. Everything is electronic, so you can take a picture, you can change it, and then print out very, very quickly. Old photographs, it didn't work that way, and it's quite a long, laborious process. So your camera, you'd have a piece of film, a bit of material, which if light touches it, it will store an image. So you take a picture, and if you have a look on the left-hand side, that would be your negative. So the camera would produce something called a negative. And what the photographer would then do is they'd go to a dark room, a red room, because red light doesn't affect the materials that are used. And then what you do, like the second picture here, is you would pass light through your negative, and that would hit a piece of sensitive paper, light sensitive paper. And what you do is you kind of project the image onto it. So as soon as the light hits the paper, it changes the paper. And then what you do in the third picture is you take that photosensitive paper and then you put it into a number of different chemical solutions to seal it, so the paper stops being chemically sensitive, light sensitive, I mean. And then finally, you let your picture dry. And that's how a picture was generally created. A photograph would be created that way. So quite a long, slow process. And it's important because that's what we're going to look at in the poem. Now, why don't you just have a quick look at these pictures. A lot of these pictures are taken from very, very famous moments in time, in history. But what they all try to do is to give a sense of that time and an explanation of what was happening then and now, and give us that kind of idea of what it's like, because that's what photographs do. They capture a moment in time, so we're able to understand or empathize, feel with the plight that's going on with these people. If we have a look at the top row, so in the top left, we've got that one man against four tanks, which is a very, very powerful image, which shows you one man standing up to a very, very powerful army, a force. And we can see that sense of power, that he's not running away, he's standing up to them. And then the next one along, which is World War II, which is when the American soldiers were claiming victory. And you can see you've got several soldiers working together to lift that flag. The next one along, you've got the Boston Marathon, where a bomb went off, and you can see the panic, and you can see, there's somebody injured. The bottom left, quite interesting, that's the end of World War II, and it's known as the Kiss. It's very famous because what happened as soon as everything finished, people just sort of were so happy that this one man picked up, found a girl and just kissed her. and that was just showing how happy it was. And people took the photograph and thought that symbolised the joy and the happiness of this event itself. The picture in the middle with the mother, okay, really interesting picture, because this is, if you think about Of Mice of Men, it's that kind of time in American history about the Great Depression. And this is a photograph taken of somebody that was affected by the Depression, and you can see that you've got the woman who is the mother and the children looking away. And this gives a sense of that idea of how poor they were, and obviously, but the determination that the mother is in that she's doing, she's not giving up. She wants to keep going, whereas the children are clearly upset about it. So it gives that sense. And then the next one that we can see, and obviously there's a conflict going on, but look how close the photographer is to the person that's wielding a gun. So that gives us an idea of what these war photographers are actually dealing with and how close they are to the subject. Now, Carol Ann Duffy, the poet, from an interesting point of view, and she makes it here, is that poets from ancient times have written about war, and it was the poet's obligation, it was their duty to bear witness, to be witness to things. So poets are like that. And in a way, I think Carol Ann Duffy is saying war photographers and photographers are a bit like that in a way, and through this poem, is that they've got a duty to be the witnesses for what's happening. And she said that the war poets, like Wilfred Owen from Exposure, that the young soldiers of the First World War turn the horrors they endured and witness in trench combat, which slaughter them in their millions, into a vividly new kind of poetry. So they translated that horrible stuff into a vivid, which means you can't forget, kind of poetry. But then she thinks about herself because she's a modern poet, and she's saying that modern poets haven't gone to war in the 21st century. But what she says is today, as most of us do, poets largely experience war wherever it rages through emails or texts from friends or colleagues, in war zones through radio or newsprint or television, through blogs or tweets or interviews. So in a way, she's saying that it's the poet's duty to be a witness, to be the person that speaks up about things that are happening, and it's their duty. And she's saying that, okay, Wilfred Owen may have fought in the war, but she's got a part to play in explaining and sharing that experience. And that kind of helps us understand where she's looking at things from, because she hasn't had the experience. Now, we do know that Carol Ann Duffy had a friend who was a photographer in conflicts, and that was part of the inspiration behind the poem itself. The pattern that we've got with these poems is we're not going to jump straight into the poem. We're going to think of some big ideas before we look at the poem. So what I'd like to do is just make some notes about these questions. So, why do war photographers risk their life? What is a war photographer's experience of war? And finally, is it worth the risk? Okay, so just pause the video for me, and when the pause symbol disappears, then we'll kind of talk about what you could have said or any ideas that you've got. Okay, so just quickly pause the video and jot down your ideas. Okay, now before we look at the poem, we're going to just go through some of these questions. So, why do war photographers risk their life? Well, the first thing, we kind of talked about this before, is money. All right, let's be honest about it. You can get a lot of money from this. If you get that one photograph, it can make you rich. Okay, so that's one angle. Now, the other angle is think about journalists. Photographers are a bit like journalists. They're looking to tell a story, but also they're looking to tell the truth. And they want to tell a message. They want to say what's going on. And in a way, they're kind of our eyes and ears for what's going on. Now, all the time there's something going on, and we don't always hear the full story. And that's why journalists and photographers are so important in society, because they help us understand. We're lucky nowadays that technology allows us that we can beam information straight away. But why do they risk their lives? Well, yes, for money, but also they feel they have a duty. They want to tell the truth. They want to say what it is. They want to risk things so that the truth is out and that they can make, in a way, the world a better place. Because if there is a tyrant who is being horrible, then the photographer and a journalist can help stop this and help highlight the cause and help stop things happening. Now, we know that journalism, there are issues with journalism about the question of truth. Whose truth are we listening to, and who's telling the truth? But I think that's the key thing. In principle, that's what photographers are doing. They want to tell the truth, and they want to show us that experience, to show us what's really, really going on, and to see the full picture and the clear picture. So what's a war photographer's experience of war? Well, if you can imagine, they would be going into wars, and we saw in that one picture, they're going to war without a gun. They will not have a gun. They cannot carry guns with them. And often they have special privileges in conflicts where they are able to go to places where most people and soldiers wouldn't go, but they have in some way protection because they are photographers. So they can't defend themselves. So in a way, they are helpless and they are bystanders and they are distant from what's going on. Now, it's a hard situation for them because they could see somebody shooting an innocent person, but they cannot really get involved, and it's not up to them. And there's a question of morality and ethics in there. Is it the right thing for them to do? Well, it's a very, very tricky and a grey area, because actually they're there to present the news, and if they get involved in the actual experience themselves, it does cause problems because about their impartiality, because they're involved in it. So it is a really tricky thing, because really they're there as observers and they're there to report the war and report conflicts. They're not there to fix things, they're there to report it. So that's going to put them into very, very difficult situations. Is it worth the risks? Well, that's a tricky question, isn't it? Is it worth the risk? And I think you've got to think about it maybe probably morally, that they are doing a good job. They are helping and making the truth known. So yes, in a way, it is worth it. And maybe the fact that they're going to be remembered and that picture is going to be remembered for a long time, maybe that is the thing that makes it worth it. Okay, let's go through the poem then. So, War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. In his dark room, he's finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening, as strange as features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval, without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement, The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. Right, let's go back to these ideas then. So, I'm going to pause the video for you and want you to think about now, go back to your original ideas and see if we can link any of those there. So, why do war photographers risk their life? What is a war photographer's experience of war? Is it worth the risks? Okay, so just pause the video and just think what you can say in relation to those questions about the poet. Okay, one thing to remember with poetry is you start with the ideas first. Don't start with techniques. Always start with ideas. And that's why when we're looking at these poems, we're starting with ideas. We're not suddenly going into techniques. We're looking at ideas and thinking, how do they link together? So why do war photographers risk their life? Well, I think that for me is what this poem is about. It's questioning why is he doing it? Because at the end of the poem, he says they do not care. So I would say, in a way, that the photographer here is doubting what he's doing. Is what he's doing, is it having an impact? Is it changing? And I think this poem is quite a moral poem, because I think this is somebody who wants to fix things, who wants to make the world better, and is trying to make the world a better place. And he, in a way, he kind of feels guilty about the things that he's seen, but he wants the world to be a better place. And the fact that you've got the editor and everything is reduced and to simplified, and it describes how, he's taken a picture and the picture represents what happened, yet the editor will take all of his pictures and only pick a few of those. So he'll reduce the experience, and then it'll be printed in a newspaper, a supplement in a magazine, in a newspaper, and then that then will be reduced again, because all it will do is it will make the reader's eyeballs cry. So what we're getting is a watering down of this whole experience, that something for him is really raw and horrible and terrible, and each time, in a way, it fades value and it isn't effective as it is. Now, we all know about photographs, fading over time, and this idea of the horrible event which a photograph is trying to recreate and capture, it disappears and it's watered down. And so why do war photographers risk their life? Well, because they want to protect people, they want change, and I think you can see that. That's what he's trying to do. What is this war photographer's experience of war? Well, clearly it's a bad experience that he's had, that he's going back to it at the end of the poem. So it's not that bad that he's never going again. I think morally he feels he needs to do it all the time, even though it's not having the effect. I think he feels guilty. I think the things that he sees about children running in nightmare heat, about blood stained in the foreign dust, I think all those things, they haunt him. And this is a poem about somebody being haunted by the experiences that he's seen and his helplessness. Is it worth the risks? Well, I don't know. For this person in particular, there's clearly something that he wants to do, and at the moment it's not working. And I think it's not a question about the war photographer. I don't think this poem is saying that the war photographer is the problem. I think the poet is saying that it's us, that we're not listening to what the war photographer is saying and showing us, and that we're blind and that we don't care. So I think that's what we're talking about in the poem. Okay, so we're going to look at several things in the poem now. Now, we're not going to look at everything in the poem, and remember, a poem has got hundreds of things, and we're not going to look at those. What I would suggest that you do is make notes and look at what other people have said online and on YouTube about the poem, because lots of people have different ideas and they pick out different things. We've just picked out a few things to help you understand the poem, but you might find something else in the poem. And that is the great thing about poetry, is that there's always something new and new things to find in there. So what I've done is I've picked out three symbols that are used in the poem. So we've got the one of the priest in the opening stanza, and then we've got the ghost, the half-formed ghost, and then we've got the beer, the pre-lunch beers that happens at the end. I think it's quite a nice little structure that we've got there with those symbols. So just pause the video and just think, what is the symbol here? What is it meaning? Why has the poet made this particular image in the poem? What's he trying to teach us? And think back to those ideas that we were talking about. So just pause the video now, and when the pause symbol disappears, that's when you can carry on watching the video. Okay, let's go through the images then. So the interesting thing when we look at these poems and look at the symbols is that Carol Ann Duffy was raised a Catholic. So it's interesting that the opening stanza of the poem refers to a priest. And obviously there's lots of things to do with Catholicism. So the idea of Mass, a priest preparing to intone a Mass, all that stuff. And then we've kind of obviously talked about the flesh and the idea of the sins of the flesh, but also the idea of a red light. Now, red could be a symbol of blood, but it's also a symbol of sanctuary, because we know over the altar is often a red light, and that's to indicate sanctuary, a place of safety that people can go if they want to escape and have some protection. So in a way, we've got quite a number of things going on here, because we've got the dark room, which is a place of safety, and the idea of the church being a place of safety. And so this is where the photographer, the voice, feels safe. And this is very, very important for him. It's his own little bubble to protect himself. Now, the idea of the priest is an interesting one, because what do priests do? But they spread the word of God, and they pass message, and they try to teach people. And I think that's a really, really important symbol to have, because in the way, this is what a war photographer does. They're trying to teach people. They're trying to show people what's good and what's bad. And in a way, they're one person representing something bigger, but they're talking to lots of people with their photographs. So a sermon is the photographer's photograph, isn't it? So you can see that symbol there. In the middle of the poem, it talks about half-formed ghosts, and it's talking about the photographs and the photographs revealing themselves, and it describes them. The strangest features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. So we know that ghosts are obviously a dead person, a spirit of a dead person. So it's the idea that these photographs are already dead. These people are dead. And actually what a photograph is a ghost. It's a metaphor, but it's a ghost. It's an image of what somebody used to look like when they were alive. And so in a way, it's quite an interesting metaphor that we've got there in the poem, that be about ghosts and photographs being a form of ghost, and that you can see them, but they're not quite themselves. But also there's another element in there as well, because ghosts, you can't touch them, you can't feel them. So the idea is that this is something you can't control and you can't do. So just like these memories are like ghosts to him, they haunt him, but there's nothing he can do to get rid of them. So that's a very interesting symbol that we've got there, all linking back to this, really the psychological impact of being a war photographer. And then the last symbol, okay, the beer, the pre-lunch beer. Now, beer makes us think of relaxation, makes us think of the weekend, it makes us think of maybe fun. People have alcohol to enjoy themselves, but also they have alcohol to forget. And so I think this is a really, really powerful image, because I think what's at the heart of the poem is this idea that people really just want to forget. They don't really want to be reminded. They'll read the newspaper and they'll cry for a second, but then they'll forget about it. And is this a comment from Carol Ann Duffy, where she is saying that as humans, we're not as caring as we like to think we are? And in fact, we're more bothered about ourselves and shutting off emotionally and having a drink and enjoying ourselves. We're not caring about those who need our care and support. And so I think it's a really, really interesting symbol to end with, because I think it's, in a way, a wake-up call to the reader and saying, yeah, you may be upset, but you know what? You go and have a beer or you go and have a bath and you forget about it. And I think this is what we've got in the poem, is this idea that the photographer cannot forget. And yet the people who are reading newspapers do forget. And maybe it's that anger because you're always looking for the next picture that's going to make people remember and not forget. Right, we're going to move on to the language now. So we're going to zoom in some language choices. So again, pause the video, and when the pause symbol disappears, that's when I'll explain some of the choices there. I want you to just jot down any notes of anything you notice about some of these words or phrases, or if there's any techniques that's going on here. Okay, so we're going to start with top left then. So here we've got Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. Okay, and we've got a list. And each of these, with this list, it links into a different conflict. This obviously gives a sense that actually he's been around the world in all the different conflicts. So it shows you that conflicts are not isolated to one place, that they're happening everywhere. But also I think the sounds, if you look at the sounds, you know, the B, the Beirut, okay, and Phnom Penh, the idea of what we've got is lots of plosive sound, which means a plosive sound is a sound that makes you use a lot of your mouth, you know. And so what it does is quite harsh sound as well. It could suggest kind of like the violence that's associated there. But the fact that it's a list gives that sense of the size and the amount of conflicts that are going on, that it's not just one or two things. And the next one along, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. So highlighted here are adjectives. And so when we look at home and presumably England, the things that he's dealing with is ordinary and simple. And in a way, I think we've got that contrast between what is it like in a conflict and what is it like at home. In a way, it seems ordinary and boring and dull and not exciting, and it kind of heightens how bad things are in the conflict rather than here. If we look at the next one then, a stranger's features faintly start to twist. Now twist, an interesting word. So obviously it's kind of not a very positive word, it's quite a negative word and quite a painful word. So maybe what the poet is suggesting to us is about the pain. Yes, the picture is recreating things, but it's also recreating the pain and the experience of what's happening. The last one, from the aeroplane, he stares impassively. So impassively means without emotion. So by the end of the poem, he's lost all emotion. He's without emotion, which is kind of ironic given that He wants people to feel emotion for what's happening and for what has happened in the terrible things. But also I think the interesting thing is that it ends with an aeroplane. And an aeroplane is about distance and taking you away from somewhere. And I think this poem, in a way, is about taking him away from things, getting away from things. It's interesting that the start of the poem starts with him in a dark room, away from other people. You know, he's getting away. It's that sense of escape. Maybe he doesn't know where he belongs. Okay, now there are other things about the poems that you can talk about. You don't necessarily just have to talk about words, you can talk about other things, and you can talk about the form or the type of poem. So what's interesting here is that we have got some rhyming in our poem. So it follows this structure, A, B, B, C, E, E, and it follows that structure throughout the poem. Now we've got 4 stanzas, fairly usually similar all the time, but we follow that structure there. So what I'd like to do for me is just think, why is the poet used rhyme in this particular poem? How does it link in to what's going on in the poem? So just pause the video and just have a bit of think about why do you think the poet has particularly rhymed this poem? Because most of the poems that we look at don't rhyme. Okay, so let's think about it. So rhyming, if it's used, it tends to show that maybe somebody's quite organized and quite clear. And so we've got quite a few rhymes. So maybe what we've got is just normal life. And so the rhymes represent how normal things are. And, you know, he's going back to England and how life is quite normal and routine. He even used the word simple, didn't he? And ordinary. So maybe the rhyme reflects what life is like for everybody else. You know, they're not really that bothered. They have a beer and then that's it. You know, they see something sad and then life goes on. And I think the breakdown in the rhyme, if you have a look, so A and C are where it doesn't rhyme. And really what a photograph is trying to do is trying to break down the normal life and the normality and actually show what's going on. So on one hand, the break in the rhyme and the lines that are not rhyming could reflect for this person, you know, that attempt to try and break the way that people normally think, their normal thinking. And it's that kind of little thing that we've got that's trying to break through. That photograph is trying to change their ordinary thoughts. So the rhyme is the ordinary life, and the one little bit that doesn't rhyme reflects and symbolizes the photograph. It's trying to break their ordinary life. Or we could say that the rhyme and the bits that don't rhyme could reflect the actual voice of the poem. He's trying to live a normal life. He wants to be normal, but he can't because he's constantly reminded of what happens. And so his normal life is the rhyming, and then he's being reminded. So that A and C is the bit where he sees something and he's reminded about it. Another thing you can talk about, and remember, you can talk about these things in conjunction together. So you can talk about the structure and the form, or you can talk about the symbols and the structure. They're not in isolation together, you know, so you do mix these things up together, and it's better to do that. Now, if you have a look, the poem, it's quite interesting how it's structured. So it starts off, the first bit, where we've got in the dark room. And in the dark room, he has memories of where he's been. Then we go to the second stanza, where he's preparing the photograph. So he's putting the solutions and putting the photograph in there. And then he has a memory to something. And then in the third stanza, can you see a pattern for me? The photograph is forming, and then that makes him have a memory. And so the last bit, the end of the poem, in a way, it has the editor selects the photograph and then he's in the aeroplane. So really the poem starts and ends in a different place. So the locations change. But we've got this kind of structure that's going in here. Memory, memory, memory. something happens, then there's a memory. So what I'd say is the way that this poem is structured is it shows us that this voice has been affected so much. So he's trying to do his normal job, but he keeps being reminded of what's happened. And I think the last stanza, the reason why it's different, and always talk about when something is different in the poem, even if you can't think of the technical word, always talk about why it's different, because that's where the poet is breaking a pattern. And if you look at the last stanza, he's breaking the pattern, because I think that's where Carol Ann Duffy wants to make her point. And her point is about the media, and it's about us, and the fact that we don't appreciate what a war photographer is trying to tell us. We're not listening to that message, and if we don't listen to that message, then he stops caring, and it's that kind of cycle that we've got there. So if I just go through a little bit about the poem in terms about how it's structured, and we have got a cyclic structure to the poem. It starts and ends with him being on his own and trying to escape. And in a way, the voice is trying to escape something. So in the first one, it's the beginning, it's escape from maybe his thoughts. And then at the end of the poem, it's escaping from the fact that people don't care enough. And in the middle, and really the first, second and third stanza, is all about the process of the photograph. And as I said to you in the beginning of the video, of what the process looks like and how you make a photograph and what it does. Okay, now remember, when we're looking at the poems, talk about the ideas, talk about the techniques, and then talk about what is it teaching us. And this is a really key thing, and don't forget this bit, because really it's going to help you expand ideas. So see those words on the left hand side: teaches, criticize, attacks, advocates, celebrates, warns, exposes. Those are the kind of words you need to be using when you're explaining the purpose and why is the poet writing this. So what is the poet trying to teach us? Well, maybe the poet's trying to teach us about the power of memory and how sometimes some things are so bad that we can't forget them. And so this man has seen the worst things and he can't escape. And in a way, he's probably angry that other people aren't affected in the same way he is. And he's trying to tell them what's happened, and yet they're still not aware of it. I think we're also seeing the human aspect of war, because in the poem it's talking about children, about a man's wife. It's talking about the people. It's not about fighting, but this is about how people are affected by war. And, you know, from a photographer, he's a distant person. He's not involved firsthand, but it's affected him. So if it's affected him, what is it doing to the people involved? I also think this poem is teaching us about how helpless photographers are, that their duty is to tell a story and show a picture, but how helpless they can't do things. They can't pick up a gun and start shooting because then they get involved. I also think it's about the emotional attachment, that Duffy is exposing how emotionally detached we are and how actually there's a sense of apathy. We don't really care, and we kind of go, oh yes, oh that's sad, and move on. And I think that whole line there, tears between bath and pre-lunch beers, you know, we get upset only in between the things that we enjoy in life, you know, bath and a beer. We're more bothered about our enjoyment than about other people, and I think that's quite a powerful message. We're also seeing the psychological impact of war. Here is somebody that's been in war. He's not killed people, but possibly seen people killed. And what does that do? And so we're seeing a different element of death and how those people watching a death, how it affects them. We kind of understand in our heads what it's like to kill somebody and how traumatic that might be. But here we're seeing what happens if you're a bystander and you watch this death. Also, the transient nature of concern. So transient means it's kind of there and it disappears. It's moving all the time. It's sometimes there, sometimes it's not. And I think this is the idea that our concern isn't always there. And I think maybe what Duffy is teaching us is really that we're very, very selfish as people, and that actually, we only concern ourselves in a tiny little bit of our time. The rest of our time we're enjoying ourselves. Remember then, taking this further in your writing, where else do we see this in the poem? Why does the poet have this stance? Now remember, we've said this before, but it's no problem mentioning it again, that a lot of modern poets haven't lived through war, but what they have done is they've seen the impact of war. And so they've seen how war has changed people. And because it changed people, World War I and World War II, it made people think about it more and think about the psychological impact of war. What is the poet trying to do? Well, I think clearly Duffy is trying to make us reevaluate our understanding of war, but also our responsibility about war and what we feel about it. Have we become numb to the sensational elements of newspapers? Have we seen too much war in the newspapers that in a way we've kind of become a bit blind to it and we're no longer concerned? And key thing is, what's going on at the time? Was there anything going on at the time that might influence the way that the poet is writing? Okay, connections. Now, one of the things you're going to have to do is make connections between the poems, and the connections you can make with this is this poem is about memory, and a lot of the other poems are about memory. There's one poem in particular, Remains, is about memory and being haunted by memories. In a later cluster, in cluster 2, there's a poem called Extract from a Prelude, and that is about a memory that happens and it haunts somebody. The power of images. Now, the power of images is in all the poems because all poems use imagery, but I think this is a clear one because it is about photographs. It's about the physical thing. There is a poem later on called My Last Duchess, which is about a painting, and we see the power of a painting can have, which is a very, very similar sort of thing. We've also got the power of truth and how powerful truth can be, and how, that desperation to share the truth of what's going on. This poem is also about the conflict between soldiers and civilians. So here we've got, soldiers fighting and the civilians who are blind to it. If we think about exposure, we've got that distance between what's happening at home and in the battlefield, which is what's happening in this poem here. Terrible things are happening with soldiers and battlefields, but at home, the civilians, they don't care, they're not that bothered. And the other thing we've got here is the conflict between entertainment and truth. Here, people are more bothered about their enjoyment of things and entertainment rather than the truth of things. Okay, last task then. So we're going to go through some quick questions to help you memorize things for the exam and help you memorize the poem in particular. So just quickly, piece of paper, jot down what you can remember about the poem through these questions, and as soon as the pause symbol disappears, that's when I'll go through the answers. So pause the video now. Okay, so where does the poem take place? Well, that's a dark room. What colour is the light of the room? It's red. Name 3 places that the war photographer has been. That's Belfast, Beirut and Phnom Penh. What R is how the poet describes England, rural. What G is how the poet describes the person in the photograph, ghosts, half-formed ghost. What S is what the pictures will be printed in, Sunday supplement. What metaphor does the writer use to describe the photographs? Well, we've got 100 agonies in black and white. And what contrast does the writer use to show how lucky we are? Well, that's the tears between the bath and the pre-lunch beers. Number 9, what religious reference is made in the poem? And that's the Mass and the priest and the red light. Okay, that's it there. If you have any questions, do message us on Show My Homework. Look at the other videos. Certainly do look on YouTube for other videos about the poem. That will help you give you bigger, better, wider understanding of the